So Formula One has added a third Grand Prix in the United States in Las Vegas for 2023. And my friend posed this question to me. Is there really a market for it? And more specifically, is there a market for 3 races? And that is a great question, and one that is right up my alley, having a degree in sports marketing. This is a 2-part question. Why does F1 want to go after the US market? And then secondly, is there enough demand for F1 in the United States, especially 3 times? In fact, while writing the intro for this script, I got the notification from the F1 app confirming the return of a Grand Prix to Vegas and had to rewrite the introduction of this script from a rumored race to a confirmed race. First, let's take a brief look at F1's history in the United States. F1 has traditionally been a European sport. In 1999, Malaysia became the first Asian country outside of Japan to host a Grand Prix. However, F1 has raced in America much more consistently. You can track the first ever United States Grand Prix all the way back to 1959, with the event taking place at Sebring, with Bruce McLaren winning the inaugural event. In 1960, the event would be moved to Riverside before then moving to Watkins Glen, where it would remain for the next 20 years. In 1976, Long Beach played host to a second Grand Prix. 1976 saw the United States join Italy as the only other country to play host to 2 Grand Prix in a season. Due to financial reasons, in 1981, the United States Grand Prix at Watkins Glen would then be dropped from the calendar. The United States would continue to have 2 races as racing moved from New York to a parking lot in Las Vegas. This would become the start of the Caesars Palace Grand Prix. It only lasted until 1982. In 1982, the United States made history with the addition of the Detroit Grand Prix. The United States became the first country to host 3 races in one season. 1983 would be the end of the Long Beach Grand Prix, and it was replaced in 1984 by Dallas for a one-off race. From 1985 to 1988, the Detroit Grand Prix was the only F1 race in America. 1988 would be the final race in the Motor City. In 1989, the United States Grand Prix returned in the form of a street track on the streets of Phoenix. Phoenix would play host to the United States Grand Prix through 1991. In 1992, the United States would be without Formula One for the first time since 1958. Indianapolis Motor Speedway built an infield road course to try and attract F1 back to the US, and it worked. Indy hosted their first race in 2000. The race was marred with a tire controversy in 2005, which I've already made a video on. After the troubles of 2005, F1 failed to renegotiate a contract with Indy and would once again leave the US after 2007. F1 would not return until 2012 when Circuit of the Americas was built. In 2022, Formula One will once again hold a second race in America for the first time since 1984. And in 2023, America will host F1 3 times with a Saturday night race in Las Vegas. The United States Grand Prix is the 10th most held Grand Prix at 42 times. This excludes Long Beach, Vegas, Dallas, and Detroit, as those took place under different names. The United States has held the 4th most amount of Grand Prix of any country at 71. This includes 11 Indianapolis 500s, which was part of the World Championship from 1950 to 1960. The United States ranks behind Italy at 102, Germany at 79, the United Kingdom at 76. So here's a graphic to help explain the history of F1 in America and when all the races took place. I combined Caesars Palace and the new Las Vegas race into one entry because they are in the same city. America was only the second country to host multiple races in the same season. America was the first country to host 3. Italy is the only other country to do this, having hosted 3 races in 2020 as part of F1's COVID schedule. So let's take a brief look at why F1 may struggle in the US. There's many reasons that F1 may not be successful. One of the most obvious is the time difference. Races are typically at 8 or 9 a.m. Eastern time or 5 or 6 Pacific time. Now, I watch every race, but I don't typically watch practice or qualifying. That's due to the time difference. If that time difference wasn't so bad, I would definitely watch these sessions more. And as F1 continues to push sprint races, they are demanding more awkward times for more meaningful sessions on their American fans. Additionally, there's just other options. IndyCar, NASCAR, IMSA. These series race at relevant times to their American audiences, with American teams and American drivers. Teams and drivers that even most casual fans know. Additionally, and this is most true of NASCAR, but fans have an opportunity to watch drivers come up and develop. As you can easily watch Xfinity and truck races for NASCAR, fans have an opportunity to form attachments to drivers before they even get to the top level. This isn't really true with F1, at least in America, as F2 and F3 races aren't broadcast on TV by ESPN. Instead, you have to go online to stream those races, and even then, it's limited in the sessions you get. The lack of an American driver and successful American team. Without an American driver, it's hard for new fans to pick a new driver as they have little to no knowledge of other drivers. The last American to compete a full season in F1 was over 15 years ago with Scott Speed in 2006. And it's not because there aren't any good American drivers. The same goes for not having a successful American team. This makes the Andretti proposal so much more interesting as it creates an opportunity to bring in an American driver and an American team that I'm almost certain will be trying to win races. Haas isn't trying to win races. They just want to be competitive in the midfield and act as a junior team to Ferrari. They've said this themselves. Now, let's look at why Liberty Media wants F1 in the United States. America is huge and has a huge economy, but don't take my word for it. According to the World Bank, they have the United States as having the highest national GDP of any country in the world at 20.95 trillion US dollars. Comparing that to the highest GDP in Europe, which is Germany, at just 3.85 trillion. These are based off 2020 figures. Also, Investopedia has the US economy at just under 25% of the world economy as a whole. The total of the GDP of the 9 European countries that F1 races in is just over half of that of the US's GDP at 10.587 trillion compared to 20.95 trillion. The US has a nominal GDP of over 5 times that of the highest country in Europe. This is why Liberty Media is so invested in pushing F1 in America. The combined population of the 9 European F1 hosting countries is less than that of the United States, at 287.9 million compared to the US with 331 million. In terms of land size, Europe is 3,930,000 square miles, while the United States is 3,796,742 square miles. So you have a single country that is the size of Europe, with around 44% of the population of Europe, and a GDP that is 83% of the entire GDP of Europe. The bottom line is, the United States is a huge economy with a huge population, and it's important to sponsors. In fact, Red Bull just signed a 5-year, $500 million title sponsorship with Oracle, an American company. Here's a graphic listing all the team's partners that I could easily find to be American This is probably not a 100% accurate list. I might have missed some. And then there's some you could argue aren't American because they're subsidies of other companies that aren't American, but I included them because they have headquarters in the US. But this just gives you an idea of how many companies the F1 teams work with that are American. And for those non-American companies, almost all of them still do business in the United States. Companies like Red Bull or Mercedes, they're not American, but they still sell their products in America, and getting their names and those products in front of the world's largest economy is important. Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak said they expect 170,000 visitors for the new race in Las Vegas and expect an economic impact of $500 million. While, yes, the US economy is huge, the real question is, are there people that want to spend their money on Formula One? You can give me a ton of people with all the money in the world, but if they're not interested in what I have to sell, it's going to be very hard to sell anything. Even if you say all those people like Red Bull but hate racing, it wouldn't make sense for Red Bull to spend money on marketing their products through motorsports. NASCAR during the 1990s and early 2000s was growing, and doing so at a rapid pace, becoming the second most watched sport in America, behind only the NFL. Well, they couldn't sustain that growth long term, and viewership dropped, and it continued to drop before eventually stabilizing again. The cost of this dramatic decline was the loss of major sponsors for teams as they found less return on their investment. A future consequence to come out of this is probably going to be a loss of value in NASCAR's TV deal when they renegotiate a new contract. Now, NASCAR still came out better than they were before they entered the boom, but sponsors still didn't feel their investments were worth it, and many pulled out. So, can Liberty Media sell F1 to Americans, thus selling the brands that keep F1 going, and do this long term? 2021 figures showed that ESPN averaged 946,000 viewers per race, setting milestones for pretty much every race. The viewership numbers were up 56% from 2020 and 41% from 2019. Showing the growing popularity of F1 in America. The 2022 Saudi Arabian Grand Prix became the most watched F1 race on ESPN since the network acquired the airing rights in 2018 from NBC. Circuit of the Americas had over 400,000 people at the track throughout the 3-day weekend in 2021. Now, these numbers could be slightly inflated due to there not being a race in 2020. In March 2021, Drive to Survive became the most watched show on Netflix in the US. In 2022, Season 4 of Drive to Survive topped #1 in 33 different countries on Netflix, including the United States. The question is, why is there an increase? The only real way to get an idea of this is to use existing data or conduct market research. I don't have the ability to conduct market research due to limited reach and thus incomplete data, so I have to try and make sense of existing data. You could say an increase in viewership in 2021 was due to the ongoing battle between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen for the championship. There's nothing wrong with that, but let's say we get a more boring season where the driver dominates a bit more. Will those viewers stick around? As I said, without doing market research, it's hard to say. I would almost certainly say you would lose some, but the question is how much. Drive to Survive has been credited as being a main reason for the success of F1 in America. McLaren CEO Zach Brown said, quote, "It's gotta be the single most important impact in North America. Almost every comment you get out of someone out of the US, they reference Drive to Survive," end quote. Drive to Survive has been heavily criticized for creating drama where there isn't any. They've been criticized for editing clips together that don't actually go together to over dramatize every situation. The point is, Drive to Survive isn't always that real, and amidst criticism, and F1 looking into possible changes for Drive to Survive, is it going to retain the same type of viewership that it's had? It's again hard to say without market research, but it depends on if and how much changes get made. But I could easily see a drop in viewership if F1 reins in Netflix and stops allowing them to cut together race footage with radio messages that don't go together. It's just hard to say without getting into the head of the viewer and understanding why they watch. President of Circuit of the Americas, Bobby Epstein, said, quote, "Before we opened, there was very little interest or awareness in America about Formula One because they had no presence here. The first few years, it's hard to know if you have a bright new shiny object or have something that people really love and come back for and aren't just curious about. What you can't buy is history, and you can't buy tradition. You have to make it and earn it. The crowds here have told us we're absolutely doing something right." End quote. So the bottom line, though, is that people are not just interested in Drive to Survive, but they're also watching races, as proof by the ratings boost that ESPN has had. The question is, can this be sustained? But is F1 popular just because Drive to Survive is popular? Or has Drive to Survive made F1 popular? It's confusing, but what I mean is F1 just popular because people like Drive to Survive? And that if changes to the show are made, will it then make F1 less popular? Or the second being that people liked Drive to Survive and use that as an entry point into F1 and thus have become dedicated fans. I mention this though because of the criticism for their creative editing and F1 talking about possible changes to the show. If it's the first and people only like F1 because of Drive to Survive and changes do happen with a negative impact, that could then negatively impact F1 in America. I also caution F1 is moving a bit too fast here. They made the deal with Las Vegas before even seeing how the Miami Grand Prix was received by fans. I think they could be moving a little too fast, but I do see the reasons for going ahead on paper. I just think that this could very easily turn into NASCAR 2.0. And it was like what I mentioned earlier. NASCAR experienced a huge boom, invested a lot of money into building new tracks in high-profile markets, and expanded seating capacity at current tracks. And then the bubble burst, and NASCAR was left with tracks that they couldn't sell like they were, and these tracks were no longer sustainable. Now, NASCAR came out better than they were before the boom, but definitely worse off than at their peak. The fear here is that a similar thing could happen to F1. They could be left with contracts to races they can't sell, which would leave F1 in a worse position than they are now. The question is, how dedicated are the American fans to F1? The problem is, this is a very hard question to answer without the appropriate market research, because you can't get into the head of the fan and figure out why they watch the sport and what would affect changes in their behavior. Even with 3 races now in America, it would still be over a 20-hour drive to the closest race from where I live, at least in America. Because actually, despite 3 races, the closest race is Canada, and that's still over 10 hours away. I see F1 as a fad right now in the US. Over time, it will wear off. I know I made comparisons to NASCAR, but I don't think it will be as bad as NASCAR. I do expect F1 to eventually see a decline in viewership, but I do think that they still will be better off than they were before. I think a lot of F1's success in America hinges on Drive to Survive. If they can keep Drive to Survive popular, then F1 can probably stay popular. If Drive to Survive loses its popularity, then F1 will lose its popularity. A lot of it comes down to Drive to Survive, as that has been the primary driving force for viewership in America. I think Liberty Media and F1 also know this, and that's why they've given Netflix as much freedom as they have. The question is, will they continue to just allow them to do whatever they want and over dramatize things? So yes, I'd say there is a market for 3 races right now, but I'm not sold on there being a market for 3 races 5 years down the line, let's say. One of the big problems that could cost Liberty Media is their love of long contracts for races. Miami is on a 10-year contract, I believe. Coda is currently only on a 3-year contract, but I'm not sure about Vegas. Getting stuck into contracts long term at tracks you've never even raced at can be a bad thing. But this goes for F1 in general, as they have a 10-year contract with Qatar and don't even have a racetrack for it yet. So now you've heard from me, and now I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on F1 adding a 3rd race in the US? Do you think F1 can have 3 successful races in America? Do you think Liberty Media will try and add additional races in the United States? What do you think about F1's long-term future here? Let me know what do you think down in the comments. Thanks for watching, and until next time, so long everybody.